Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming along. My name's Roger. In case you don't know that, I'm one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion. We're very honoured tonight to have Chris from New York, and we're going to be doing an interview and then opening things up to questions from the people watching. I want to sort of just go through a few points before we start. First of all, the views expressed in this video don't necessarily reflect the views of everyone in XR. The idea is for these interviews just to sort of provoke debate and open discussion. And I'm not talking officially on behalf of XR or anything like that. I'm just talking for myself. I've got a few sort of general questions to ask Chris about obviously the whole situation, and then we'll take things from there. The second thing I want to do is just acknowledge that we're in the middle of an unprecedented crisis. The coronavirus has changed everything and is changing everything by the day. And I think we should all be aware of what massive suffering is going on around the world at this moment and is going to get even worse over the coming weeks. And I think we need to look at what's happening with a very serious manner, I think, because this is real. And one of the reasons I feel it's good to have Chris on is because Chris has been making really uncompromising statements about the reality of our situation for a long time. And it seems a good idea to have him on tonight to discuss these matters. I am not going to say in massive detail what Chris has done or not done. Suffice to say, was, as Robin said, journalist with the New York Times, and he's written 14 books on the state of the world. And I am going to open up with a few general questions, and then if that's all right with Chris, then I'll invite some questions from the people watching. Okay, so my first question is, obviously a lot of people know you, Chris, in the States, and I expect a lot of people in the UK, who are primarily people watching this video, I guess, haven't heard of you so much. So what I'd like to just start off with, if it's okay, is you just giving a general background to your life and your progress to this point in time.
So my father was a Presbyterian minister, also a World War II veteran. He had been in North Africa. I grew up in a small town. I lived next to the church. My dad was the major influence on my life. He was very involved in the civil rights movement. This was at a time when in small rural enclaves, such as the one we lived in, Martin Luther King was one of the most hated men in America. Indeed, people walked out of his sermons. He was part of a group called Concerned Clergy and Laity Against the War, founded by the radical priests, Catholic priests Dan and Phil Berrigan. Phil Berrigan later became a close friend, baptized my youngest daughter, opposing the Vietnam War. I was a boy in the 60s, but he took me to these events, had a profound impression on me. And finally, he was very outspoken in terms of GBLTQ rights. His youngest brother was gay and lived with his partner in Greenwich Village and had been disowned by most of the families. So the only family my uncle had, Jamie, was us. And my father translated that pain of being a gay man in America in the 1950s and the 1960s into the injustice that the church in particular visited on GBLT community, the cruelty of the church, and he was eventually pushed out because of that. So he set the template for my own life. I went to divinity school at Harvard. Although I was a writer by nature, wrote since I was a child, published my first piece when I was 12 in a historical journal. It was actually the history of my father's church. Published a piece in the Christian Science Monitor while I was still in college. But I couldn't reconcile the supposed neutrality and objectivity of journalism with my father's commitment to social justice. So I moved into an urban ghetto in Boston, Roxbury, and ran a small church as a seminarian across the street from Mission Main, Mission Extension Housing Project, which was at the time one of the it was without question the most dangerous and roughest project in the city. And that's where I often say I learned to hate liberals, people who talk about empowering people they never met. I would travel from the ghetto back to classes in Cambridge at Harvard, and saw through exactly the way that kind of rhetoric was used for self-adulation would be the only way to put it. Well, in fact, the actions carried out by the liberal elites were selfish and self-centered in large part. And I dropped out of divinity school. I went to South America. I studied Spanish in Bolivia with the Maryknoll Fathers, and decided that I would be a journalist in Latin America. This was in the early 1980s, so you had the dictatorship in Argentina, the military junta that had disappeared 30,000 of its own citizens. You had Augusto Pinochet in Chile, Rios Mon in Guatemala, a murderous regime in El Salvador, where I would end up spending 5 years as a reporter. And I felt that it was as close as my generation was going to come to fighting fascism. And this was, of course, rooted in my reverence, which continues to this day, for George Orwell. So that was how I stumbled into journalism. It was informed by that kind of social justice of giving a voice to people who otherwise would not have a voice. It put me in war zones for pretty much 2 decades. I spent 5 years covering the wars in Central America. I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I was in Sarajevo during the war in the former Yugoslavia and then Kosovo. And these were jobs that other reporters at the New York Times didn't want. As in fact, when I went to the executive editor of the New York Times, Joe Lelyveld, and told him that I wanted to go to Sarajevo, his response was, well, I guess the line starts and ends with you. So people say, will often look at my career, because I was 15 years with the New York Times. I was the Middle East bureau chief. I was the Balkan bureau chief for the Times. And I think incorrectly assume that somehow there was a change. In fact, because my role at the institution was to stand as a reporter with those who were dealing with severe repression. I mean, even, of course, horrific violence. When I got to Sarajevo, it was being shelled. There were 2,000 shells a day. 45 foreign journalists had already been killed by the time I got there. A photographer I worked with was wounded 3 days after I got there. And 24 people wounded, 4 to 5 dead, killed every day. So I imposed myself in those kinds of situations. That's why I spent so much time in Gaza. And I was offered at one point in London. I didn't want to go to London. I had nothing against London. I like England, but I had zero interest in reporting, on the royals or God knows what else you do from a first world country. So I came back to the United States and did a fellowship at Harvard in classics, mostly reading the Aeneid in Latin. Went back to the paper, and that's when my troubles began, because I applied the same kind of radical critique to the Bush administration, the calls to invade Iraq, which I publicly opposed, which angered the paper. Now, one could speak quite frankly about Slobodan Milosevic, and work for the New York Times, but one could not speak quite frankly about George W. Bush and work for the New York Times. And that's what got me into trouble. I was booed off of a commencement stage in Rockford, Illinois in 2003 for denouncing the war. It's on YouTube. And then the right-wing trash media, Fox News, Wall Street Journal wrote an editorial denouncing me. And I was given a formal written reprimand by the New York Times and told I was no longer allowed to speak about the war. And I remember it was an easy decision. I'm not going to pretend it was. My palms were sweaty. I lost my job, not just my job, but my pension. I knew I was cooked. If I continued to speak out, I would not be hired by any journalistic enterprise in the United States. And but I also knew, as I sat in that office, that in order for me to muzzle myself, which is what they were asking me to do, was kind of to pay fealty to my career, but to do that would be to betray my father. And I remember walking out of the building on 229 West 43rd Street in New York, and I think articulating for the first time that what my father had given me, who himself had been pushed out of the institutional church where he had worked for 40 years, was freedom. I didn't need the imprinter of the New York Times to tell me who I was. I don't have a doctorate, so I have a master's degree. I started looking for a job to teach high school English and coach track. I used to be a track runner in college and high school. And I had written a book called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, which I didn't expect anyone to buy. It was kind of an examination of the culture of war after 20 years of covering war. And it just became this massive bestseller, sold hundreds of thousands of copies. And that allowed me to sustain myself as a writer, which I have done ever since. And as Roger pointed out, I examine culture. I wrote a book on the Christian right called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War on America. I wrote on the collapse of liberalism, a book called Death of the Liberal Class. I wrote on, our post-literate spectacle society. It's called Empire of Illusion, the End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle. I wrote a book with a great cartoonist, Joe Sacco, called Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, which is written out of the poorest pockets of the United States. Camden, New Jersey, per capita, the poorest and most dangerous city in America. The coal fields of southern West Virginia, Pine Ridge, South Dakota, Native American reservation, where the average life expectancy is 48 for a male. That's the lowest in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti. The produce fields in Florida, where literally you encounter examples or scenarios of slavery. I interviewed undocumented workers who at night were chained inside a truck, and their families are threatened back in Guatemala or Honduras if they attempt in any way to report what's going on, this kind of abuse to the authorities. So that's been my work since I came back to the United States. And then I would just also add, because it's important to me, in that I teach in a prison. I teach through Rutgers University. I teach college credit courses to those who are incarcerated, my students who are incarcerated. We graduated 27 formerly incarcerated from Rutgers University this year who had been released, and we conferred degrees, BA degrees, on 33 on the inside. And if you go to YouTube and type in Chris Hedges Rutgers graduation, you can see the graduation talk that I gave. So I think there's a complete, in my mind, complete consistency to both my politics and my commitment, although, of course, working for an elitist, mainstream publication like the New York Times, I think sometimes it's not understood by people who just read the straight resume.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, one of the reasons, well, I've actually interviewed you before, haven't I? But, one of the reasons I personally have been really interested in your work is because you've had so much practical experience of the real world. And I guess that's pretty rare, particularly in thinkers and intellectuals who haven't actually been on the front line, as it were. And I think this is like, one reason to talk to you tonight is it sort of feels to me, at least, that that real world has suddenly exploded in areas where it hasn't been, let's put it like that, for a long time, 2 or 3 generations maybe. And I have to confess that for myself personally, although I like to feel like I understand the world, I've had moods of feeling a little bit at a loss about exactly what's going on. And so what I'm interested in is in the light of your experience, how do you think we should understand the coronavirus crisis, both in your country but also globally? I mean, what are you thinking about it at the moment?
It's the first fatal blow against the structures of industrial neoliberal society. These structures have been hollowed out and weakened. Look at your National Health Service. by the forces of neoliberalism, by these global corporate forces, these speculators and financiers who have seized control not only of national economies. You don't control your own economy any more than we do. We just saw this with the quote unquote stimulus package that was passed today, that provides gigantic bailouts to the airline industries. And we know from 2008 what they're going to do with the money. That's why the stock market has rallied. They buy back their stock, they pay themselves huge bonuses, and they lay off their workers. So we've hollowed the country out. The foundations of capitalist democratic systems, both within the UK and the United States, are weak and tottering. And the coronavirus, the pandemic that now faces us, is the first assault against a structure that's so enfeebled that it can't handle it. This is particularly true in the United States, where we're really in for it here. Just anecdotally, I know numerous people who have what looks like severe corona symptoms, including my friend Joe Sacco, and yet they can't get tested. And one of my friends is a doctor, and she couldn't get tested. And so the number of cases in the United States, because although we had adequate warning, of course, but we didn't have the test kits, we don't have the protective gear. New York City is turning into a disaster zone with makeshift morgues, tents already being set up outside of hospitals. We have projected unemployment now at 30%, economists are saying. I think it was 3.3 million filed for unemployment last week. And you have to remember that because of, unlike Britain, we don't have a National Health Service. It's a for-profit healthcare system. So we have huge segments of the population that are outside of the healthcare system completely. Not just undocumented workers and the 80 million people who are either underinsured or uninsured, but now all of these workers that had employee-provided health insurance, that's 58%, who are losing their jobs. The estimate is that to be treated for the coronavirus, it's $30,000. So you're going to be slapping people who don't have work with these gigantic medical bills, or denying them medical care at all. Indeed, the teenager recently who died of corona was turned away from the hospital because he didn't have insurance. And so we haven't contained the virus. It's spreading exponentially because of a lack of testing. We don't know where it is, so we can't contain it. And we have a structure in the United States which guarantees that people will not receive adequate medical care, or they won't even go in to get tested. Remember, the 11 million undocumented workers in the United States don't have access to medical care, and they're not about to show up in an ER where ICE, the immigration service, can grab them and throw them in a detention center, which is a whole other issue because people are being warehoused, including children, in these detention centers where the virus will spread. We also have 2.3 million people in our system of mass incarceration. That's 25% of the world's population. Once the coronavirus gets in those prisons, it will rage because of the close confinement. And of course, one of my worries is that corona's been identified in the Gaza Strip, which is one of the most densely populated and spots on Earth without not only just adequate medical care, but even adequate supplies of clean water. And I really think this all goes back to the destruction of the kinds of institutions that certainly were put in place in the New Deal in the United States, were put in place in old labor and then dismantled by Tony Blair and Margaret Thatcher, and later Tony Blair and quote unquote new labor, dismantled in the United States by Reagan, and then our version of Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, and Joe Biden, let's not forget, was an integral part of this. And so the system has been reconfigured to serve the interests of these global corporate oligarchic elites for a long time at the expense of the rest of us. And now, because of the stress caused by this pandemic, we're paying for it. I don't see how we're going to come back from it. Certainly not like before. You have the capitalist class, and we've seen it with Trump, call for this ridiculous idea that you can return to work by Easter Sunday, because they would rather 1, 2, 3, 4% of the population, and of course the most vulnerable part of the population, die rather than see the economy go into a tailspin. It's going to be, I mean, one thing's going to trigger another. I mean, so Americans, if you have a certain income level, you may get a check for $1,000, which is ridiculous. It's going to get funneled right back into your landlord's pocket or the credit card companies or something else. But then what? We're already hearing about rent strikes. There's one underway in St. Louis, and that's because especially low-income people can't pay their rents. And then what happens? This is a accelerating problem as we speak, and wasn't even addressed by the stimulus package. It's a terrible word, but the bailout for big industry that was just passed today. So what happens then? Well, if history is any guide from 2008 and from today, then the huge multimillionaire slumlords like the Kushners, this is Trump's son-in-law, will get bailed out and the people will be on the streets. So the system doesn't work, or doesn't work for us. And as these stresses multiply, and as the system fails in any meaningful way to rectify the suffering or address the suffering that is gripping larger and larger segments of the population, then the problem will only be exacerbated and made worse. I mean, what did we do in this bailout package? They extended unemployment benefits for 4 months. I mean, this is ridiculous, and it phenomenally short-sighted, because it will create social unrest and social upheaval. What direction that will take, I don't know. The United States has a large segment, I mean, most of them support Trump, who are in essence fascistic in their outlook. As the situation deteriorates, I have no doubt that Trump will do what he has done in the past, which is to incite violence and exacerbate racist attacks against people who will be blamed for the breakdown, undocumented workers. I mean, now we've got Chinese Americans, liberals. We're already seeing Trump's effort through lawsuits to muzzle the press. I mean, we're headed, I think, I'm worried. I mean, certainly in the United States, I can't speak to Britain. I don't know it as well, but certainly in the United States, we're headed to a very kind of frightening corporate totalitarianism. And we have created both legally and physically the mechanisms to put that, in essence, totalitarian system in place in our deindustrialized urban pockets where poor people of color live, where there is no work, and the only work you can get is in the illegal economy, which pushes you right into the prison system, the jails and prison. We have militarized police. By that I mean police who are issued military-grade weapons. That's long-barreled weapons, Kevlar vests, armored personnel carriers. If you watched the riots in Ferguson, you saw it, or the uprising in Ferguson, you saw that equipment, and with 50 caliber machine guns mounted on top, aimed at unarmed protesters in the streets. That with a flip of a switch can be used throughout the whole country. And we've created legal mechanisms, largely through terrorism laws, which have been used quite ruthlessly against Muslim activists in the country since 9/11, to strip you of habeas corpus, due process, even impose secret trials where defendants are not allowed to see, or including their lawyers, the evidence that's being used against them. So it's all there. It's all ready to go. Hannah Arendt writes about this in Origins of Totalitarianism, where she warns, and she herself, of course, after spending 3 weeks imprisoned by the Gestapo, is expelled from Germany and stripped of her citizenship. So she's undocumented in France. She's stateless. And she writes about the phenomena of being stateless. And she said, once rights become privileges, once the state has the ability to strip you of your protections as a citizen, then everyone can be stripped of those rights, which of course is what Germany ultimately did. So I think, as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. There are lessons of the past that we should heed, and I'm very worried. I mean, on a personal level, I'm worried for my children, but I'm also worried for where the United States potentially is headed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like a lot of people have been waiting for something to happen, right? Because there's so many tensions and so many dysfunctions in the systems that we have to live through. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about some of the underlying structures that have led us to this situation. I mean, you've been writing books since what 2000 about these structures. And there's a deeper story here, I guess, that you've written about is why Western societies have come to this place of vulnerability, and where we are today. So maybe referring to some of your books, maybe you can say a little bit about these underlying processes.
Well, I'm not a Marxist in the sense that I don't buy into Marx's utopianism of the proletariat state. That's Hegelian, but I do think Marx's analysis, with the heavy contribution of Engels, who had the data of capitalism, is correct. That's why the first volume of Marx's 3-volume Capital, and I admit it's a slog, is an important book. And as Marx understood, unfettered or unregulated capitalism, these are his words, is a revolutionary force. And that's because it, by its nature, commodifies everything. The human world becomes a commodity, human beings become commodities, the natural world becomes a commodity that it then exploits until exhaustion or collapse. And that's what, and let's not divorce capitalism from imperialism and white supremacy. I mean, having spent 2 decades in the developing world, I understood very, very well that imperialism was the expression of white supremacy beyond the borders of the empire. The Brits, perfected that notion of the white man's burden and the Raj, and it's its most revealing example or illustration of the inherent racism within the system, because you impose by force, you take control of countries where people of color live, and you exploit cheap labor. That's what capitalism is doing now, corporate capitalism, and you plunder the resources. I remember interviewing once the president of the Congo, not the Belgian Congo, but there's 2 Congos, but not Zaire, but the Congo. And the French oil company was in there taking all of the oil, and even the president of the country had no idea how much they were taking. Indeed, the state French oil company had its own private army, that French mercenaries that control the oil fields within his country. And so capitalism by nature, when it's unfettered and unregulated and uncontrolled, will go in and exploit natural resources and human beings until collapse. And that was the fundamental reason that Joe Sacco and I went out and did our book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. We went to the places where capitalism destroyed first. Take the coal fields of southern West Virginia. I mean, when we got the coal field, and I encourage everyone who comes to the States to see it, because that's what's going to do to the rest of us, which was the idea of the book. So it's just a toxic wasteland, billion-gallon impoundment ponds filled with heavy metals and carcinogens. You can't breathe the air. Every couple hours we were in a 4-wheel vehicle, I'd have to get out with paper towels because all of my windows were black from the soot in the air, from the coal dust, from open pit mining, from these drag lines, mountaintop removal, of course. You go into the elementary schools, and in the nurse's office, there were rows of little inhalers because all the kids can't breathe. The water, I mean, in some of these hollows, you could turn on the faucet and light the water on fire. Cancer was an epidemic. They owned the judges, they owned the press. I'm talking about the coal companies. They owned all of the governor, they owned all of the state legislators. And we wrote the book to say, they were first, but we're next. And what's happened with imperial capitalist expansion is that they don't have any place left to go. They would go into a certain area and destroy it, and then move on to somewhere else. One civilization would exhaust resources, collapse, and move, and then the Spanish would do its conquest, and we are one of the few countries that carried out, in essence, imperial expansion internally before in 1898 we turned on Spain. But what do they leave behind? Now there's nowhere else to go. It's been 400 years of pillage, looting, environmental destruction, and the game's up. So this time, but I hesitate to use the word civilization, but when industrial power goes down, the whole planet's going to go with us. And we've reached, I think there's strong evidence we're beyond the tipping point. We're certainly, which XR knows, in a period of mortal peril, existential peril, and we're powerless just as we're powerless to get our government to respond in a rational way to this pandemic. We're powerless to get them to respond in a rational way to the ecocide that ultimately will kill all of us, because this is the nature of unfettered and unregulated capitalism. And I'm a Presbyterian, actually I am ordained, but I come out of Calvin, very dark view of human nature. I don't like capitalism. I see it as the enemy, but I also realize that not everyone, but a significant portion of human beings are dominated by self-interest. But if you don't regulate and control that self-interest, then it destroys your society. And that's what's happened, with the difference being, instead of the old capitalist class, the people who ran the textile mills in Birmingham or Manchester, it's a global capitalist class that has moved manufacturing into, don't use this to be, overly dramatic, but into slave camps in China. I mean, certainly the Uyghurs are slaves, or appalling sweatshops of wage theft and terrible conditions. And when workers don't meet quotas, they're not paid, and they climb on the tops of these overcrowded dormitories and jump off and commit suicide. And so we've kind of rolled backwards. 70% of the U.S. economy is based on consumption, most of which, of course, we don't need. And that's what's freaking out the capitalist class. This pandemic has essentially shut that consumption down. And so, you're watching seizures within the capitalist system that are quite profound and quite dramatic, and maybe hard to roll back. And with those seizures will come profound social dislocation.
Yeah. So, I mean, how I see it, and I think how you see it, is that, the climate crisis, obviously Extinction Rebellion is primarily orientated towards, is the inability to deal with it is an outcome of some of these things you've been talking about. And I suppose for a lot of people, it feels like the coronavirus is a precursor to the climate crisis. There's a lot of similar dynamics. Its inability to assess risk, its inability to protect those that are vulnerable. Is that how you would see it, the larger sort of climate crisis situation?
Yeah, because the climate crisis, we know, will create a very similar phenomena, in that it will destroy coastal cities. We know that it already is, because of rising temperatures, increasing pandemics and the destruction of crops through droughts and wildfires, look at Australia, and through pests that are no longer in colder months controlled. So yes, I look at this pandemic as, I hate to say it, but the beginning of the end. It's even if we get through it, and in the United States, there are going to be a lot of people who die because of the tremendous ineptitude on the part of the corporate elites here. I mean, the idea that we don't have even stockpiled masks because we don't make anything anymore except weapons, that we don't have ventilators, that we don't even have enough hospital beds. We're using military hospital ships to go to Los Angeles and New York. I mean, I think this exposes the internal rot that has been going on for a few decades, and the inability on the part of this rapacious corporate oligarchic elite, which has consolidated both wealth and power into their own hands. Ralph Nader, who I admire and is a friend, and I was a speechwriter when he ran, calls these people traitors, and he's right. They're absolutely traitors. They have no loyalty. They'll use the resources of the state, whether it's the Federal Reserve or the military or the courts or the legislative bodies, to further their own interest. But they're incapable of understanding or fostering in any way the common good. And there's two rules. There's one rule for them. Trump, his entire life, has been an example of this. There's one legal system for them, and there's a completely different system for us. Matt Taibbi wrote a book about this, which is good, called The Divide. And that's right. And I think the great mistake on the part of liberal elites, and this would be true for people who supported Sanders, and I was quite public about this in 2016, and I think I've been proven right in 2020, is that the Democratic Party, which is, as Ralph says, it's just one, it's a duopoly, it's one corporate party. You just get to pick which flavor you want. Do you want to be a nativist, racist, Islamophobic, homophobic, with a Confederate flag plastered on the back of your pickup, or do you want to be inclusive and tolerant and want to have a woman president or a gay president or an African-American president? Actually, Obama wasn't African-American, he was biracial. His father was not from the United States. But as Cornel West said about Obama, he was just a black mascot for Wall Street. It's an advertising gimmick. On all of the substantial issues, whether it's imperial power, we just saw it with this bailout bill, whether it's free trade, whether it's the security and surveillance state within the state, there's no difference. They argue over what Freud called the narcissism of minor difference. These are largely cultural issues, some of which are important, certainly women's right to choose without question, but they're tangential issues to political issues. The cable news shows will spend all of their time, having people fight over these issues. And I think, but it's really a way to cover up on how on all of the major issues this latest trade bill, which was passed to replace NAFTA, which is just NAFTA with another name. I think there were 50 people in the Congress that voted against it. It was almost complete unanimity by both parties. And so Schumer and Pelosi are figures of the corporate state. Their power comes from funneling Wall Street money to the anointed Democratic candidates. I was with Bernie Sanders in 2016 at the climate march with Shama Sawant, the socialist city councilwoman from Seattle, and she was pressing him about running as an independent, arguing correctly that the Democratic Party was never going to give him the nomination, and that we were never going to build a sustainable political movement, or he calls it a political revolutionary movement, in an election cycle. And I think 2020 has just proved his naivete. Bernie's answer was, I don't want to end up like Nader, which means I don't want to end up a pariah. I don't want the Democratic Party to mount a campaign so I lose my Senate seat. I don't want to lose my seniority within the Democratic caucus, which he has. You know, I'm going to be a loyal lieutenant to Schumer for 4 years, and they're going to give me a chance. And he was wrong. And I think XR, one of the reasons I like XR is it gets it. The system is not going to respond to us. The only hope is to pit power against power. And that means to create centrifugal forces of power outside of the system.
Yeah, well, this seems to me like one of the main things that like separates you from other commentators, because I think a lot of commentators, you know, have a fairly standard analysis which sort of reflects what you've said, you know, that the system is basically broken. But it seems to me like they don't want to cross the Rubicon to actually say that rebellion is both necessary and justified. And I think that's something that maybe more people are going to start thinking about as a result of what's going to happen over the next few months. And I think like the question for me is, okay, so, you know, Bernie Sanders' campaign isn't the political revolution he claims it to be. Then what does the political revolution in 2020 look like? You know, what are the main structures and features and organization or, you know, features that point the way? Because the fact of the matter is no one really has got a lot of experience of it in the Western world, right? It's not like we've been doing this for a long time. It's been 30 years of people trying to do gradualist and reformist sort of measures, you know, often with really good intentions, of course, but it hasn't actually brought us anywhere, as we're finding out at the moment. So what's your vision? You know, how do you see that political revolution?
Everything within our power to obstruct and destroy the mechanisms of corporate power and their ability to garner profit. That's why I was at Standing Rock. I was, you know, in France with the Yellow Vests. I was with XR in New York when we shut down the street in front of the New York Stock Exchange. That's it. That's our only hope. And I don't share the culture's kind of mania for hope. I think hope is, or the selling of false hope is disempowering. I think the first thing we have to do is face the bleakness before us, and even accept that we may not succeed, but that we have a moral imperative, especially for those of us who have children, because they're going to inherit what's left of this world, to get out and fight in every way possible to make that world sustainable for them. So I don't know if I'm going to succeed. I'm 63 years old. But I at least want my kids to look back and say that I tried. And that's going to be uncomfortable. I don't like going to jail. I've been to jail, not for a long period of time, but I've been to jail, as you have. That's kind of more time than I care to donate to the U.S. government, but I'll do it. And you know, even if we fail, we create a community. We nurture life within what I would call a culture of death. And I guess in that sense, I fall back on somebody who comes out of a faith tradition, and I'm not in any way trumpeting one faith over another. I spent 20 years overseas. I saw how people out of all faiths and all tradition rose up on behalf of the oppressor to fight for the oppressed. And those are the people who I have kinship with and who I admire, whether they're Muslim or Hindu, or it makes no difference. But I do think that the fact that I come out of a religious tradition is not accidental, because as Daniel Berrigan, the great radical priest, said, when I asked him to define faith once, he said, faith is the belief that the good draws to it the good, even if all empirical evidence says otherwise. I think that there is empirical evidence that the good draws to it the good. It's why, like XR, I'm rooted in nonviolence. But then we have to let it go. I mean, there's no surety, there's no certainty. And certainly that within our lifetime, I mean, within my lifetime, everything that I fought for has gotten worse. but that I don't think invalidates what I've done. And I think that's where being rooted in a faith tradition, I mean, certainly our two greatest prophets in the United States, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, came out of, deep religious traditions and beliefs. There's a wonderful moment, people forget, there's a one great biography of King by Garrow called Bearing the Cross. People forget that King, like Malcolm, at the end of his life was a very lonely figure. I mean, most people had walked out. The young black activists had gone off to the Black Power movement. He was booed when he went to Watts after the riots. And the FBI, after he denounced the Vietnam War in 1967, a year to the day from when he was assassinated, withdrew his protection, his physical protection. And both King and Hoover and Johnson, President Johnson, knew what that meant. King knew he would die in the same way that Malcolm knew he would die. And there was a moment where King was with his staff under tremendous pressure, and he just got up and he said, I take nonviolence to be my lawfully wedded wife, and sickness and his health. And I think that at that moment you saw the power of faith, that King himself was watching his movement disintegrate. He knew his life was going to be terminated very soon, and that is finally what sustained him, in the same way that that's what sustained Malcolm X.
Yeah, and I think this is again something that separates you from a lot of conventional sort of commentators that, to my mind, seem to be still transfixed with a sort of material utilitarian sort of rationale for action, which is, we can make things better and we need to work out how to do it, and then we go and do it. And if we can't, then we don't act. And I mean, my reading and the tradition I come from is very much, my parents were Christians as well, and what have you. And the tradition that I feel like I come from is there's a good way to live your life, and that's all you can do. You can't expect anything more. This life doesn't owe you anything, And I think what's sad, I guess, is that we've lost, because we've had things so good for so many people, I guess, in the West anyway, you've sort of lost hold of what that actually means. And I'm just wondering whether, when the first time I saw your videos, I was quite shocked, because I felt like you were talking directly to me, because you were referring back to some traditions that really don't get referred to. And I feel personally like we need to reconnect with some of those historical philosophies or ways of life or ways of resistance. And I was wondering, maybe to just finish off, you can talk a little bit about what you think those main philosophies or ways of being are, that younger people today can learn from.
Well, you're right. As soon as, I would say both for revolutionaries and for the religious, the practical is irrelevant. Hannah Arendt said, don't trust people who say this shouldn't be done or this oughtn't to be done. Only trust those people who say I can't. So I just lost my job at TruthDig, where I have had a column for 15 years every Monday, because the staff went on strike over the attempts of the wealthy heiress who funds the site to fire the editor, Bob Sheeran, because of a series of labor abuses, including the attempt to give employees contracts where they sign away all their labor and civil rights under California national law. Now, that wasn't practical. I mean, the irony is that she didn't pay me. I had actually raised through grant money my own salary for the site. And the site has been shut down and all of us are unemployed. But there wasn't any question as soon as she started. It would have been, easy, I suppose, to try and have some kind of accommodation. But I couldn't stand by and watch what she was doing to Bob Scheer, one of the legendary journalists in the United States, the former editor of Ramparts, and he's almost 84 now, one of the titans of American journalism. And at the beginning, it was just me. I mean, I called him and said, well, if she pushes you out, you're not going out alone. it ended up snowballing, and the entire staff went on strike. And so, and some of these editors have taken, that's the only source of income they had. So the economic cost for them is far greater than for me. I am in the midst of writing a book, and I have a television show, and they don't. So they're far more courageous than I was. But again, it's that, you can't, it's not about what's practical, it's about what's right. And I think that when you take what you believe, insofar as you can determine it, as a moral stance, and you don't pay a cost, then it's probably not that moral. I mean, most moral stances, if they're truly moral, I mean, we all can, talk about the evils of Jim Crow or something, these kinds of horrible systems of the past. But one of my problems with this church in the United States is, where are they on mass incarceration, which for me is the civil rights issue of our time? They're nowhere to be seen. So the rhetoric of the liberal class never matches its actions. But I think for the revolutionary, the radical, and ultimately the religious, it does come down to, as Aaron said, I mean, I can't. It's what's right or wrong, no matter what the consequences are. And not only that, but it's right or wrong, no matter what the outcome is, even if the outcome, at least in the short term, appears to be detrimental to what you say and want. And I'm going to be very hard to pick up. I mean, the editor called the Nation magazine, they don't want me. I mean, they don't want this kind of critique. I mean, I'll find somewhere to go. But life's short. You learn that in war. And in the end, you want to look back and, not regret that you didn't stand up, not regret that you were crippled by fear or self-interest, that your life meant something. I mean, that comes down to the fundamental question of what constitutes a life of meaning. And, as Faulkner said, every life viewed from the inside is a failure. We're all, in that sense, failures. But I know that, Auden said, these ironic points of light that flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. I mean, I am propelled forward by these figures like my father, who stood up at personal cost in the past. I can't betray them, and I won't betray them. And they allow me to define what is a life of meaning for me, even if the rest of society not only doesn't recognize it, but even attempts to negate it. And I think that is the power of, we would say, bearing witness, doing what is right. That there is, I mean, Berrigan became a close friend before he died. The great radical priest burned draft records with homemade napalm, and then stood there praying until they arrested him, put him in a federal prison for 23 months, broke into nuclear sites and poured his blood over weapons. He just wouldn't stop. And when you have those kinds of bonds, those kinds of relationships, and especially as you age, as I'm aging, in many ways, their presence becomes more real than the presence of people around you. They're constantly, I mean, it's very close to the theologian James Cone, who we just lost. America, hands down, America's greatest theologian. His book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, is stunning, where he condemns the white church and white theologians for never denouncing lynching, which they never did. No theologian ever mentioned it. And he talks about lynching as a modern form of crucifixion, because remember, they lynched children. And he said, there it was, the crucifixion right in front of them, and the church couldn't see it. And he talks about that commitment to the crucified of the earth. And that's our role, that we are to stand with the crucified of the earth, and that when you truly stand with the oppressed, ultimately you will be treated like the oppressed. And of course, that is the greatest validation of a life.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm glad we touched on what it really means to for each of us as individuals. And I think that's really what it comes down to at the end of the day. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of people watching this call, and it's easy to have the right analysis. It's not so easy to look into your own self and decide what it means to be who you are, right? That's the difficult bit. And something we all struggle with every day, of course. But yeah, I really want to thank you for your comments about these things. And I think Robin's going to organise a few questions from people. Is that right, Robin?
I think
So
Karis has
we've
got
got about 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, if people have got questions, feel free to chuck them in the Q&A. Karis is gonna help with asking them to you guys.
Yeah, hiya. So I think we'll start with a question from Marco. He says, do you think that at this time and place, it's more important to want to win or to want to be right?
Most revolutionaries throughout history don't win. Most of them get extinguished. That's just a historical fact. And the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr says that, what revolutionaries or people who revolt, rise up against the system are endowed with is sublime madness. And by that, he means that the traditional mechanisms of liberal reform don't work. They're too tepid, they're too intellectual. And Niebuhr adds that the problem with liberals is that they don't ultimately understand evil. And so if you stand up and your criteria is to win, then you're going to be easily demoralized and defeated. But if you stand up because it's right, that of course doesn't mean you won't win, but it means that you're in it for the long term, that you're not wedded to the emotional highs and lows that characterize a consumer society.
Yeah, so next we have one from Jason. He says he's a podcaster in Guatemala. He was asking, how can independent media in Latin America or anywhere be most effective during this crisis?
Well, I would say that most of the examples of effective nonviolent civil disobedience come from the global South, not from the industrialized North. So I would say that he probably has a lot more to teach me than I have to teach him.
I like that answer. So Todd has asked, if civilization does make it through this crisis, how can we best direct attention to rebuild economies around something like donut economics, which factors in the Earth's resources?
So the nature of capitalism is that it only defines itself by what it's against. Communism, socialism, because its own nature is so venal and self-centered. And when the Europeans and Euro-Americans carried out their campaign of genocide against Native Americans, it wasn't only to steal the land and the buffalo herds and the gold in the Black Hills. It was to destroy a competing communal ethic, which was completely opposed to the ethic of capitalism. In an indigenous culture, people who hoarded things for themselves were despised. Either everyone ate or no one ate. And I think that ethic was as threatening to capitalism as, and perhaps most threatening to capitalism. So we have to, as indigenous communities around the world have reminded us, recover that communal ethic where everyone eats or no one eats, where those who hoard material possessions and power for themselves and their own are thrown out and despised. I mean, the great indigenous leaders like Sitting Bull, I think, offer examples for where we have to go. And Sitting Bull, scathing contempt for Europeans and Euro-Americans who thought they could buy and own land I think, directs us or helps us rediscover a kind of ethic that might make it possible for pockets of human society to sustain themselves, at least for a while.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. So we've also got one here saying, a question for Roger and Chris. It seems that we're finally getting a dose of what government and media telling the truth is like. Does this change the way that XR should look at this demand? Because it seems like the government is still inadequate even when the truth is told.
Well, I'll let Roger start with that. Are you talking about which government? I mean, as awful as Boris Johnson is, and he's certainly awful, we win the prize for, utter insanity.
Yeah, well, there are degrees of insanity as we're discovering in this crisis, aren't there? I think the Brazilian guy gets the top prize at the moment. But yeah, I mean, the way I see it is that in terms of the broader climate crisis, is there's still a fundamental denial of responsibility by governments to look at physical reality. And for me, like, the coronavirus is a really clear example of where nature decides it's going to do something, and because our culture and our political class doesn't recognize that nature has any power or any say, then it ignores it until it's too late. And for me, like, there's a direct analogy here of not telling the truth about the broader geophysical situation, which is, really straightforward, as we all know, that if you put carbon into the atmosphere, then you're going to destroy the weather systems and have mass starvation. And that's the extremity of that risk is simply not existing. I mean, I think it's an open question. I don't know what you think, Chris, but I think this crisis may go some way to actually reminding ordinary people, anyway, that there is a natural world out there, and it needs to be considered. I don't know. What do you think?
We're learning a lesson in the danger of human hubris. You go back, and I studied classics and read, all of the great classical playwrights, Sophocles, and that was a persistent common theme, that human hubris would destroy you, because there were forces, natural forces beyond your control, that if you didn't honor, and if you thought you could dominate, would crush you. And that's precisely what's happening. Consumer culture is kind of an anathema in the sense that it revolves around the cult of the self, the sense of total empowerment, extended, of course, through the access to machines, even immortality, the obsession of the culture with youth. All of this has fed very dark proclivities that are within all of us. And those who provide a dose of wisdom, whether artists or writers, or have been so pushed to the margins because their voices don't fit with this mantra of positive thinking, positive thoughts, as if somehow positive thoughts, are what we desire and what we want, and how we view ourselves, is never affected by reality. So, I hope you're right, Roger. The only thing I would say from my many years of watching and reporting from disintegrating societies is that oftentimes people have very short memories if they can get back into the particular, however unhealthy milieu that they were in.
Thank you for that one. So I'm going to just merge a couple here. So we've got one asking how you, Chris, feel about filling up jails with road blockers, and therefore, do you think civil disobedience helps in this crisis or any crisis? And if not, can we talk about some solutions?
So the point is to get so many road blockers that there's no room in the jails. I was after Occupy Wall Street, they shut down Zuccotti. We had a series of demonstrations where we took over streets without city permits. One of them had 10,000 people. What could the police do with 10,000 people? What were they going to do? Arrest 1,000? I mean, they couldn't even fit 1,000 in the city jails. So the idea is to get the numbers or get waves of numbers that in essence, overload the system so it doesn't function. Once you get 1 million, I mean, I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. We had 500,000 people in Alexanderplatz in East Germany, in East Berlin, or the same number in Prague during the Velvet Revolution. What are the police going to do? Well, they joined them, is what happened.
Yeah, that's great perspective. So we've got one here saying it's specifically about your book, but I think the person who asked it wants to hear Roger's perspective as well. Saying, in Wages of Rebellion, you paraphrase Sartre, I do not fight fascists because I will win, I fight fascists because they are fascists. I know you've looked at fascism through a religious lens in another book. Beyond just that religious scope, however, how widespread is fascism in the world? And are we past the tipping point of what you and Wolin foresaw as inverted totalitarianism for full-on global fascism?
So, yeah, I love that quote. I use it so much I've had to stop using it because I could see, like, I'd get in front of an audience and they kind of mouth it along with me, although I do think it's great. And I did steal it from Sartre, who was talking to a friend of his. He was trying to talk him out of going back to fight in the Spanish Civil War that last year when it was clear that the fascist forces were going to win. And his friend said, I don't fight fascists in French. And I don't fight fascists because they're fascists. I don't fight fascists because I'm going to win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. So, I mean, that gets to the point we spoke about earlier about just standing up and fighting evil because it's evil. In my book, American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America, at the end of the book, I was very, very, I didn't use the word fascist lightly in the title. And I went to the two great scholars of fascism. That would be Fritz Stern, who fled Nazi Germany as a teenager. He wrote The Politics of Cultural Despair. And then I went to that Robert Paxton, who wrote Anatomy of Fascism, teaches at Columbia, and I had spent 2 years with the Christian Right, which I think is a heretical fascist force, and of course that's why they're now filling the ideological void of Trump, Pompeo, Betsy DeVos, Barr, Carson. All these people come out of the hard Christian Right. And they couldn't. I mean, so I didn't use the word lightly. But I remember Stern saying that, in Germany, there was a yearning for fascism before the word fascism was invented. I think you certainly see that in the United States. You see it in Britain. Nigel Farage, these kinds of figures, even Boris Johnson to an extent, they're flirting and empowering fascistic forces. We're more advanced in the United States because the Christian Right has had years of building infrastructure, media platforms, Liberty University, Patrick Henry University. They are stacking the federal courts courtesy of the Trump administration. Betsy DeVos is busy funneling federal dollars into quote unquote Christian schools as a way, these are her words, to advance the kingdom. Her brother, Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, there was just a story in the New York Times the other day about how he has been used to infiltrate groups, including teachers' unions. I mean, he's kind of the equivalent of the brown shirts. So British society is different. And I once heard Eduardo Galeano, who I admire immensely, at a talk, start talking about American society. He just didn't quite get it because he wasn't here. So I'm not going to try and do an assessment of your society. You can all do it better than I can. But certainly within American society, those forces are real. on the last point, inverted totalitarianism, this is our most important political philosopher, Sheldon Wolin, wrote a book called Democracy Incorporated. He creates this term inverted totalitarianism, by which he means it's not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. So like the late Roman Empire, you have the facade of the American system, electoral politics, the Constitution, which has been rendered by judicial fiat null and void. We don't have the right to privacy or anything else. So you have the facade, but internally, corporations control all of the levers of power. That's what he means by inverted totalitarianism. And he says that that is different from classical forms of totalitarianism because it is about the primacy of profit. So both under Stalinism or under Nazism, profit was not the primary incentive. I mean, at the end of the war, they were dedicating tremendous amounts of railroad stock, even though they needed it to transfer weapons to fight the Soviet forces that were overrunning Eastern Europe. They filled it with, Jewish families to send them off to Auschwitz or Sobibor or somewhere. In inverted totalitarianism, profit always takes precedent over human life, which gets me right back to the healthcare system in the United States, where we are now in the middle of a pandemic watching the primacy of profit over human life.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, this comment you have about fascism, it's not just a piece of rhetoric, as it were, or an assertion. When I was doing my research on civil disobedience at King's College, I was talking to another researcher who researched like the working class miners who went to fight against fascism in the Spanish Civil War. And, the main result of his research was, again, that people didn't go to Spain in order to beat fascism. They went to Spain because it had to be done. That was the phrase. Something had to be done, and they had to do something about it. And I think, for me, this is the central theme of what actually we have to do, which is to do things because they have to be done. If you go down to London and sit in the road, obviously you want to get negotiations with the government and get change on climate change and what have you. But the fundamental reason why you're sitting in the road is because it has to be done. Simple as that, and paradoxically, my research and experience shows that the more people who don't care about whether they win or not, the more likely you are to win because you're not so vulnerable to the outcome. I mean, it's one of those weird headfuck sort of things, because you just go around in circles. But it's certainly true, and it's true in my experience of doing, various sorts of social movement work for several decades, is the people that are sustainable are doing it because it's something they have to do, because it's the right thing to do. And that's what sustains you over the long term, as you said, Chris. So, it's a major lesson, I guess.
I would also add that it gives you power, because people know you can't be bought off. People know that you're not going to be dissuaded through an argument about why this doesn't make sense, and maybe you should go talk to the Democratic leadership. It gives you a kind of power because they know that you're unwavering. So I would agree totally. It's kind of paradoxical that your power comes from the point where you don't really care whether it succeeds or not. That's where your power comes from.
Yeah. And there's a good quote I found recently from Larry Kramer, who is one of the key activists in the ACT UP campaigns around AIDS. And I think I've got this right. It said something along the lines of, we didn't give a flying fuck what people thought of us, and that's what gave us our strength. And that's a really interesting point of view. You didn't really beat around the bush, that guy. But
that's exactly right. I remember I was very critical of the Black Bloc and Antifa during Occupy, and I spent a lot of time in Zuccotti. And some of the Occupy activists who weren't Black Bloc said, well, it's hurt the movement, and everybody admired you, and now they don't. And I said, the moment I need your adulation, I'm finished. It doesn't matter what you think of me. It doesn't make any difference. My job, at least insofar as I can do it, is to speak the truth, even if it's an unpopular truth. It's not to, I'm not running for anything. I'm not a politician. I'm not trying to be popular. I don't care whether I'm popular or not. And I think that quote from Kramer is exactly right. As soon as you give a fuck about what people think, actually, Dwight McDonald, a great social theorist, wrote a essay called Mass Cult, Mid Cult, which is very good. And it's about the danger of intellectuals appealing to mass culture, and thinking that their influence is determined by the numbers of people that are able to reach, going on MSNBC or something, which didn't exist when he wrote it. But that's right. That's not actually their power. So yeah, that's we, or those of us who, certainly as a writer, who attempt to explain reality, as soon as we get caught up in what the potential reaction might be, or what the reaction is, then we lose whatever power we have, I think.
I think that's a really good point for everyone within XR. You do it because you have to. I think that's really important. So I guess just another important question for moving forwards, Roger, and I guess Chris, from your American perspective, what do we need to be doing in the UK to keep post-COVID subsidies and bailouts from going to ecocidal industries? And Chris, if you could interpret that in any way, that would be awesome.
Well, I guess I'll begin. I mean, we just passed this bill today, which does precisely that. I think that, we're going to have to build organizations of resistance, things like rent strikes. They're going to have to rent strike anyway, because they don't have any money to pay the rent if we hit projected unemployment levels of 30%. That this, the system responded the way it did because it doesn't have any pressure from us. We don't count. It costs staggering $1 billion to run for president. The people who pay for it are not paying for it because they love democracy. The elected officials get to Washington and the lobbyists write the legislation. It's kind of a system of legalized bribery. We just don't have any influence because we don't have that kind of money. We don't have that kind of clout. So what we do have is numbers. And through those numbers, we do have the ability to, in organized and concerted fashion, cripple the profits and the economy of the ruling elites. And that's our only hope.
Yeah, well, from my perspective, I'm looking mainly at what's going to happen when we come out of this, and I think a lot of people are. And I think, for me personally, Extinction Rebellion needs to be extremely clear in telling the truth about there's no going back to what we had before, because we know what that leads to, and we knew what it's going to lead to in the future if we allow the climate change situation to continue. So, I mean, again, looking at what we've just been talking about, we need to engage in mass civil disobedience because that's what needs to be done. It's as simple as that. And whether we succeed or not, who knows? But there's good reason to believe there's going to be a lot of people open to the arguments because they'll have lived through an example of what it means to ignore nature. So we'll see, of course. Shall we have one more question before we finish? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so I guess to round up what you were saying there, someone has asked, given that we know the state is simply not going to respond in any meaningful way to the climate and ecological emergency, should we be straight back onto the street disrupting non-violently as soon as the coronavirus restrictions are lifted?
Of course. That's the only mechanism we have. And in some ways, the coronavirus is a gift to the security and surveillance state because it's dangerous and people shouldn't do it right now, to form crowds where people are cannot practice social distancing. So unfortunately, the nature of the pandemic and the imperative that people isolate as much as possible, not only for ourselves, but more importantly for vulnerable communities, allows the forces that we are opposed against to consolidate power without mass resistance. However, there are mechanisms we can use, and I go back to that rent strike, that don't require people to get out in the street, and those mechanisms have to be used, and they have to be used soon.
Okay. Shall we leave it there, Karis? Is that okay?
Yeah, thanks for doing it, Roger.
Yeah, well, I just want to thank everyone for coming to this interview and this session, and obviously to Chris for taking the time to talk to us all, and Robin and Karis for doing all the technical bits and pieces. That's great. Thank you so much. And we're hoping, we're not, to do a few more of these.
Yeah.
With other people. Do you want to say a little bit about that, Robin?
Yeah, sure. So I'm just gonna show a little bit about what we're doing upcoming. So this is part of a new series that we're working on, looking at, this idea of being alone together, right? We're all in our self-isolation right now, but we've got a lot of content coming out of XRTV at the moment, where we want to support people. You know, this is a real time, I think, for emotional connection, and we've got a full program coming up over the next week with different events and talks like this coming up, but also chances to connect with each other, people's assemblies online, a chance to hear what everyone thinks about this COVID-19 crisis that we're in, and a chance to talk about, act on it, as well as, you know, fun activities like disco obedience. If you want to have a dance break online, get involved. So tomorrow we've got economics and the crisis, coronavirus, climate change, and what needs to change. That'll be with Paul Mason, and commentator and former economics editor for Channel 4 and BBC Newsnight, and also with Molly Scott Cato. So we really want to boost this program and help it grow. So if you can, people who are watching today, can you please support Extinction Rebellion to fundraise in a way that we can really continue this fight for life on Earth. As it says, COVID-19 has changed many things, but the rebellion must not stop. So if you're watching here tonight, please do go on and click on giving a monthly donation by direct debit and support us through the rebellion to help make this happen. We'd really appreciate anything you can give towards this work. And thank you so much for your time and efforts involved.
Right. Well, thank you very much, and keep safe, everyone.
Great.
Thank you again, Chris.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.